They say the measure of a person is not in what they claim, but in the promises they keep when no one is watching. Some promises last a day, some a year, but others, they outlive decades, battles, even death itself. This is not just the story of a man in uniform. It is the story of loyalty carried silently through time, of a veteran who chose dignity over recognition, and of a single moment in court that changed the fate of a young man forever. If you believe that true honor still exists in this world, stay with me and don't forget to follow, like, and share your thoughts as we begin this journey together. At the far end of Pine Street, in a modest apartment with peeling paint and a flag fluttering proudly at dawn, lived James Rowe. At 76, he carried himself with a posture that time had failed to bend. James was a Vietnam War veteran, one of the last in the neighborhood who still wore the weight of memory on his shoulders. Every morning, he followed the same ritual. He polished his old combat boots until they gleamed with an almost ceremonial shine, raised the American flag outside his door, and then walked slowly to Memorial Park. His hands, stiff with arthritis, collected the discarded bottles, candy wrappers, and cigarette butts that careless visitors left behind. To him, honor was not a word, it was a practice, repeated even when no one noticed. The people around him noticed, though not in the way he hoped. To the children who passed his building, James was the crazy old man stuck in the past. They told stories about him in whispers, saying he fought invisible enemies only he could see. Sometimes, when he walked by, they would march mockingly, raising their hands like toy soldiers. Teenagers took it further. They shouted from across the street, mimicking explosions and salutes. "The war ended 50 years ago, old man," they jeered. To them, his routine was a joke, a fossilized performance in a world that had moved on. Neighbors, too, kept their distance. It was not hatred that drove their silence, but discomfort. James embodied something they did not want to remember: sacrifice, pain, and the haunting presence of war. When his figure passed by, back straight, beret tilted just so, they avoided eye contact. They could not mock him outright, but neither could they embrace him. His quiet dignity was an unspoken reminder of truths many preferred to bury. And yet, there were rare exceptions. Mrs. Hernandez, who ran the corner store, greeted him with kindness. She had lost her grandson in Afghanistan, and perhaps that grief bridged the gap between them. Each time James entered her shop, she offered a nod, a respectful smile, sometimes a free cup of coffee. She alone seemed to understand that his silence was not madness, but resilience. James never explained why he clung to his routines, why he still wore dog tags beneath his faded shirts, or why his medals remained tucked in a box on the top shelf. His reasons were his own, and he carried them without complaint. Behind his silence, though, was a body that had begun to betray him. His joints stiffened with every winter, his hands trembled when he tried to button his coat, and yet he never faltered. Dignity, to James, was a battle as fierce as any fought in Vietnam. Each time he bent to pick up trash at the park, each time he stood and saluted to the flag, even when his knees ached, he fought and won that battle again. Then, one ordinary Tuesday morning, an envelope arrived. It was stamped with the seal of the courthouse, addressed not to resident, but to Mr. James Rowe. Inside was a summons. He had been called as a witness in a criminal trial. The name on the paper was unfamiliar to most: Malik Jefferson, a young black man accused of assaulting a police officer. The paper said it was a case of public disorder, of defiance against law and authority. But what startled James was not the name of the defendant, nor the charge, but the fact that he, an old veteran, was listed as a witness. The community whispered when they saw the notice pinned to his mailbox. "Why would they call him? He barely leaves his routine," muttered one neighbor. "What's an old soldier got to do with a street fight?" wondered another. No one could make sense of it. The children who once mocked him suddenly watched from a distance, their stories gaining new fuel. The teenagers laughed louder, imitating a gavel and chanting, "Guilty! Guilty!" But James said nothing. He folded the paper carefully, placed it on his desk, and stared at it for a long time. For decades he had lived quietly, enduring insults, avoiding explanations. Yet now, for reasons still hidden to everyone else, the past and present were about to collide. The summons was not just a piece of paper. It was the beginning of something larger, an unraveling of secrets carried for nearly half a century, promises made in jungles half a world away, and a truth powerful enough to silence even the most cynical courtroom. As dawn broke the next day, James polished his boots with the same devotion as always. The leather glistened under the weak morning light, a soldier's preparation for one final march. This time, though, his path would not lead to Memorial Park, but to the courthouse, where judgment was waiting not only for Malik Jefferson, but for every soul who had underestimated the silent veteran on Pine Street. The morning of the trial arrived before the sun had fully risen. James woke earlier than usual, the air in his apartment still heavy with the scent of polish from the night before. Hanging carefully inside its protective plastic cover was the uniform he had not worn in years. It was not fresh, not immaculate, but it bore the history of battles and comrades lost. With trembling fingers, he drew it out, buttoned the jacket, and pinned his medals. They did not shine as they once had, but to James they were more than metal. They were fragments of lives bound by sacrifice. The faded beret came last, tilted at the regulation angle. When he caught sight of himself in the mirror, a hollow man stared back, shoulders narrower than they once were. Still, he straightened his spine. Dignity would not abandon him today. The courthouse lobby hummed with chatter and hurried footsteps. Lawyers carried stacks of papers, their voices sharp, clipped, efficient. When James walked through the doors, silence did not greet him, but laughter. A security guard leaned toward a colleague and said loudly, "This guy must be lost. Probably thinks it's Veterans Day." A young attorney snickered. "Halloween came early this year." Their words hung in the air, sharp as blades. James heard every one of them. His hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his beret, but his eyes never wavered. He had faced worse than ridicule. Dignity was the only shield he had left, and he carried it like armor. Whispers followed him as he made his way to Courtroom 3. Some bystanders raised their phones, snapping pictures of the odd figure in full military dress. A mother tugged her child close, as though the uniform itself carried danger. None of this moved James. His steps were slow but deliberate, the polished heels of his boots striking the tile with a rhythm that commanded attention even from those who mocked him. Inside the courtroom, conversations faltered as he entered. People glanced his way, puzzled, curious. "Why is he here?" some asked under their breath. James took a seat in the back, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. At the front of the room sat Malik Jefferson, a young man with weary eyes and tense shoulders. He did not look at James, though the shift in his body betrayed recognition he did not want to admit. The trial began with routine precision. The prosecutor, a sharply dressed woman with rehearsed gestures, declared her case with confidence. The defendant assaulted Officer Richard Brennan during a legitimate police intervention, she announced. With a flourish, she presented Malik's past misdemeanors, an old speeding ticket, a school suspension from years ago, as if they painted a portrait of criminality. The judge barely concealed his boredom, glancing at his watch, perhaps eager to conclude another case in a long list of cases. Malik's public defender, burdened with too many clients in too little time, fumbled through weak objections. The case appeared all but decided before it had truly begun. Then came a twist no one expected. The defense attorney straightened his tie, his voice suddenly clear. "The court calls Mr. James Rowe, former commander of Bravo Company, 25th Infantry Division." The name rippled through the room like a current. The judge looked up sharply, startled. For a moment, silence pressed down on everyone. James rose slowly, and then something extraordinary happened. Every uniformed guard in the courtroom stood at attention. Their backs stiffened, their chins lifted. Respect, instinctive and unplanned, swept through the ranks. One of the guards, Sergeant Martinez, locked eyes with James and nodded. Recognition passed between them, an old trainee saluting his commander once more. The whispers in the gallery grew louder. "Who is this man?" James walked to the witness stand with deliberate steps. The click of his polished shoes echoed through the chamber. He raised his right hand, swore the oath, and sat. His voice, when it came, was steady, though weathered by time. "I witnessed the entire incident on April 15th at approximately 2:43 p.m. Malik Jefferson did not assault anyone. He intervened verbally when Officer Brennan was using excessive force against a homeless veteran experiencing a seizure. Gasps swept through the room. The prosecutor stiffened. She quickly objected, questioning his reliability, his age, his memory. But before she could regain momentum, the defense presented a piece of overlooked evidence, a coffee shop security footage from across the street. The grainy video confirmed every detail James described. It showed Brennan striking the homeless man, Malik stepping between them, and not once did Malik raise his hands in violence. The courtroom's mood shifted at once. Skepticism gave way to unease to astonishment. The judge leaned forward, removing his glasses. The prosecutor scrambled, accusing James of being a last-minute witness, casting doubt on his mental acuity. But James did not flinch. His eyes stayed fixed, unwavering. Then, as if expecting the challenge, he reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew a small leather-bound notebook. "I have documented every injustice I've witnessed for 53 years, Your Honor," he said calmly. "Date, time, location. I was there. And I was there when Officer Brennan struck a homeless veteran wearing a medical bracelet. I was there when Malik Jefferson stepped forward, not to attack, but to protect." The room went utterly still. Papers ceased to shuffle. Breaths were held. The old man who had walked in mocked and dismissed now sat in command of the room's silence. His testimony was no longer a relic of the past, but the most vital truth in the present. As the prosecutor fumbled with the objections, as Malik stared wide-eyed at the man who defended him, the truth began to cut through the courtroom like sunlight through a storm. And everyone present realized that James Rowe had not come in costume, nor for nostalgia. He had come for duty, for a promise carried longer than most could imagine. The revelation was only beginning. The prosecutor's voice rose, desperate to regain control. "Your Honor, this witness was not on our list until yesterday. His testimony cannot be considered reliable. His age, his memory, how do we know he isn't mistaken?" She gestured dismissively toward James as though he were a relic, a museum piece that had wandered into a courtroom. The judge leaned forward, studying James carefully. He removed his glasses, rubbed them slowly, and asked the question that lingered in everyone's mind. "Mr. Rowe, why should this court accept your testimony? Why should we believe you?" James reached into his breast pocket, his movements deliberate, his hands trembling, not with fear but with the slow betrayals of age. He placed the worn leather notebook on the witness stand. Its cover was scratched, its edges frayed by decades of use. "Because I've written down every injustice I've witnessed for 53 years, Your Honor. Date, time, and place. I was there when Officer Brennan struck a man who was clearly wearing a medical bracelet. And I was there when Malik Jefferson intervened. Not with violence, but with his voice." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of his words settling over every person. Even the usual rustle of paper and coughs ceased. The judge's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. "Then tell me, Mr. Rowe," he said quietly, "why? Why come forward for this young man you apparently don't know?" At last, James turned his gaze to Malik. Their eyes locked for the first time. Malik's shoulders stiffened, confusion flickering across his face. James's voice, though soft, carried the authority of command. "I know him better than most, Your Honor. I once commanded 134 men in Bravo Company, 25th Infantry Division. More than half never came home. And among those who fell was Staff Sergeant Michael Jefferson, Malik's father." A ripple of shock moved through the room. The prosecutor's pen slipped from her hand and clattered onto the table. A sharp gasp came from the gallery. Malik's eyes widened, his lips parted. For the first time since the trial began, the mask of stoicism broke. James continued, his tone steady though a muscle in his jaw tightened. "It was April 30th, 1975, the last day of the war. Saigon was falling. Civilians scrambled for evacuation while mortar fire rained around us. Michael pushed me into a drainage ditch seconds before a grenade exploded where I had been standing. He took the blast. As he lay dying, with helicopters overhead and chaos all around, he asked me for only one thing: to keep an eye on his son, a son he had never met, born just 3 months earlier, a son whose photograph he carried through the jungle for 2 years. The courtroom was motionless. James reached again into his uniform pocket, this time pulling out a small photograph encased in plastic. He held it up with reverence. "This boy," he said, "was Malik Jefferson, age 9, holding the folded flag at his father's funeral. The last man from my unit to die placed his trust in me, and I swore to keep that promise." Malik blinked rapidly, his chest heaving as though the walls around him had collapsed. He whispered, almost inaudible, "You knew my father?" James nodded once. "He was the bravest man I ever met." The defense attorney, voice thick with emotion, asked, "Commander Rowe, if you've carried this promise for so long, why haven't you ever told him? Why remain in the shadows?" James's reply was simple, his voice calm but unyielding. "Because a promise doesn't need recognition to be kept. It only needs to be honored." Several jurors wiped tears from their eyes. Even the court reporter's fingers slowed on the keys. The judge leaned back, visibly moved, his face softened by the revelation. In the back row, the police chief closed his eyes, guilt written across his features as the enormity of their mistake became clear. The defense attorney pressed further. "Have you truly been watching over him all these years?" "Yes," James said without hesitation. "I paid for his college applications when his mother couldn't afford them. I sat at his high school graduation in the last row, unseen. I made sure he had chances his father would have wanted for him. He never knew me, but I knew him. And today, when I saw him in danger, I knew it was time to keep my promise openly, even if only once." The courtroom air was heavy with awe. The prosecutor, who had moments earlier commanded the room, sat frozen, her argument shattered by a truth that no cross-examination could undo. Malik, his face streaked with tears, finally lifted his eyes to James with something beyond gratitude, something like belonging. And then came the final blow to the prosecution's case. The defense played the unedited body cam footage, the version conveniently trimmed in earlier evidence. The screen showed Officer Brennan striking the homeless veteran, showed Malik stepping forward, his words clear. "Sir, please stop. He's not resisting. He's having a seizure. Look at his medical bracelet." It showed Brennan shoving Malik back, the moment falsely painted as assault. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "In light of this testimony and the complete evidence, I am dismissing all charges against Mr. Jefferson immediately." The room erupted, not with noise but with silence of another kind. No one sat, not the judge, not the court reporter, not the guards. They all remained standing, a tribute not just to justice, but to the man who had kept his promise for nearly half a century. Malik turned to James, tears streaming. His voice broke. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" James bowed his head. "Some debts can never be repaid. They can only be passed forward." And with that, he stepped down from the stand as quietly as he had entered, leaving behind a courtroom forever changed. The next morning, the newspaper carried only a small article. "The man who made an entire courtroom stand." Few read it. Fewer still clipped it out. But for those who had sat in that courtroom, the memory was seared into them forever. James Rowe had not sought recognition, and after the trial he returned to his modest apartment as though nothing extraordinary had happened. His life resumed with the same rhythm, boots polished at dawn, the flag raised precisely at 6:15 a.m., his slow walk to Memorial Park to clear away trash. 3 days later, a tentative knock echoed against his door. When James opened it, Malik Jefferson stood on the threshold, awkwardly holding a box of donuts in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. "I didn't know what else to bring," Malik admitted, his voice hesitant. James studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Come in." The apartment was sparse. The furniture was worn, the walls bare except for one shelf crowded with the photographs. Malik's eyes lingered on the images, young men in uniform, their faces frozen in time, forever 20. At the center of the shelf stood a picture of 2 soldiers in jungle fatigues, James on one side, Michael Jefferson on the other, smiling despite the grime and exhaustion of war. Malik touched the glass with trembling fingers. "He looks just like me." His voice cracked. James nodded. "He saved my life." Malik swallowed hard, his throat thick with emotion. "And now you saved mine." From that Sunday forward, Malik began to visit James regularly, They would sit in the small living room, sipping coffee, sharing stories. Malik, who had always grown up with only faint memories of his father, now heard vivid accounts of Michael, the courage he carried into battle, the way he led with humor even in the darkest hours, the way he never stopped speaking of the son he had never met. James, usually reserved, spoke with tenderness that surprised even himself. In time, Malik began to call him Father James. The title softened the old soldier's eyes in a way nothing else could. For the first time in decades, James was no longer entirely alone. Word spread quietly through the neighborhood. The same teenagers who once mocked the crazy old veteran now fell silent when they saw Malik walking beside him, head bowed respectfully, listening to every word. The flag James raised each morning no longer seemed an eccentricity. It became a symbol, a reminder of something larger than themselves. Even the neighbors who had avoided his gaze began to greet him with nods, a hesitant respect growing where once there had only been discomfort. The ripple of change reached even the police department. The chief of police, his conscience heavy after witnessing the trial, personally visited James and Malik to apologize. Officer Brennan, the man whose actions had nearly destroyed Malik's life, was suspended and later reassigned to community service at the Veterans Center. There, forced to confront the men and women whose sacrifices he had dishonored, he learned humility one conversation at a time. Months passed, and the bond between James and Malik deepened. Malik, inspired by both his father's memory and James's unwavering example, enrolled in law school. His purpose became clear: to fight for justice in a system where so many voices went unheard. Each Sunday, he would return to James's apartment, textbooks under his arm, eager to share his progress. James listened, sometimes offering advice, sometimes only nodding with quiet pride. Then, one cold morning, the flag outside James's apartment did not rise at 6:15. Neighbors noticed. Hours later, when no movement came from within, they grew concerned. With heavy hearts, they entered and found James resting in his chair, his eyes closed, his breathing stilled. In his hand was a faded photograph of Bravo Company. He had passed in his sleep quietly, without ceremony, just as he had lived. At the door, they found a small wooden box. Inside lay his Purple Heart medal and a handwritten note addressed to Malik. I never needed anyone to know who I was. I only hoped everyone would live so they wouldn't feel ashamed when standing before a silent man. To Malik Jefferson, who stood up, just as your father once did. The funeral drew hundreds. Veterans from across the state gathered, standing at attention for a full hour beside the flag-draped casket. Malik wore James's Purple Heart pinned to his suit. He did not try to hide his tears. When the final salute rang out, he whispered softly, Father James, I'll keep your promise alive. Years later, at the courthouse where justice had been reclaimed, a simple bronze plaque was placed on the wall. Judge not by appearances, but by the measure of honor within. Each Veterans Day, passers-by noticed a man sitting quietly by a grave polished to perfection, a Purple Heart medal resting in his hands. Malik Jefferson, now a respected civil rights attorney, brought his children to sit beside him. He told them stories of two men, one a father he never knew, the other a guardian who kept watch from the shadows. He taught them that true honor is not found in medals or parades, but in promises kept long after the world forgets. He taught them that sometimes the most powerful voices are those that speak the least, yet leave an entire room standing in respect. James Rowe had walked quietly through life, mocked, dismissed, forgotten by many. But in the end, he had fulfilled the vow of a dying comrade and passed forward a torch of courage and loyalty. His legacy lived not in headlines, but in the life of the young man he saved, and in the generations yet to come. And so the story closes not with applause, but with silence. The kind of silence that honors, that remembers, that humbles. The kind of silence that belongs to men like James Rowe. Because in the end, our lives are not measured by the recognition we receive, but by the promises we keep when no one is watching.